right, this is another episode of In Search of Black Power. I'm Devon Love, Director of Public Policy at Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle. We have with us today Baba Andre Turner. I'll allow him to introduce himself.
Peace, peace. Hey, good afternoon, Black family, humanitarians of the world. I am Andre Turner, also known as Akintola, Ifasheyi Shango Bemi. Welcome and happy to be here.
So I've been looking forward to having this conversation with you, particularly in this platform. You know, a lot of the conversations you and I have had have been in the context of rights processes that I've been a part of, that you've led. And, you know, a lot of the work that I do and that LBS does, you know, is pretty explicitly on the political side of things. But we, you know, always acknowledge the importance of culture, all right, and the way that culture plays a role both in helping to orient us, helping us to think about and borrow heavily from our cultural resources and traditions. And so, you know, those are conversations that we've loosely had, you know, over the years. But in this context, I wanted to focus on, you know, a conversation about African-centered rites of passage. And, you know, you yourself being an expert, you know, practitioner and someone who's led rites, who's taught rites, wanted to dig really deep for our listeners that, again, are used to hearing about, you know, our political commentary. But I think there is a role for the importance of the kind of cultural technologies embedded in traditional African culture. And rites of passage is one example of that I wanted to delve deep into. One of the places that we start our analysis is around recognizing that, you know, the past 500 years of world history is dominated by the project of European domination of the world, right? Colonialism, enslavement, white supremacy. And it's a global, you know, we understand it to be a global phenomenon. And so, again, we deal with colonialism and thinking about the systems of power that it organizes, right? And how those systems of power organize themselves in such a way that people of African descent are dependent, right, on their institutions, their civilizational machinery, for us to navigate the world in very basic ways: food, communication, shelter, all that. But even deeper than that, like even our language for how we interact with each other, right? The systems for like socializing young people. So that's kind of where I want to start. So could you first talk a little bit about your own journey in African-centered rites of passage? And in doing that, could you talk about, you know, what it is and how it serves in many respects as a response to a counter to the project of colonialism that's afflicted upon people of African descent?
Excellent. As you said, I'm excited and happy to be here as well, Devon. Watched you and Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle move in a very mission-driven, oriented way for a number of years. Very proud of you all's accomplishments. I'm even concerned in many ways because you guys are like very like ahead of your time in terms of the work that you're doing. And when I think back on my rites of passage path or journey, what Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle provides in this moment would have made an even more significant difference in my journey. And I'll share it specifically. I began my journey around 1987, 86. And that was in New York. There was an organization called the African Poetry Theater. It was on Jamaica Avenue. For my New York folks, to 112, you knew it was probably like about 160 or something street you would pass it on that corner. It was Baba Watusi Branch. He ran African. He's now an ancestor. He ran African Poetry Theater, and their express purpose was about identity and voice through poetry. So it was very art focused. And they had cultural components connected to it. And it hinted at rites of passage. But if you would have asked me, I was clear that I wasn't something that was rites of passage. It was more so cultural. And then I went to Norfolk State at some point, and I met with, and that was the early 90s, late 80s. I met with a brother named Askia Mentuhotep, Anthony Sparrow, and he had something more comprehensive. And we'll get to this in this conversation because he was connected with an organization called the African National Rites of Passage United Collective. I didn't know that at the time, but what I said to myself was, hey, this thing is a little more intricate and complex, not complicated, but it's more intricate and complex. And I'm gonna step back. How I got to the African Poetry Theater was because I had a high level of self-hate, right? I, at about 17 years backwards, I did not like being in my dark-bodied skin. You know, I felt that it was a blemish. You know, I felt that it was my skin color stigmatized me. Something was not only wrong with my color and complexion, like overall, there was something wrong with being Black. And, you know, just by divine intervention, I found myself in African Poetry Theater. So the poetry and all of those things and those affirmations were very good for my self-esteem. Now on Norfolk State's campus, I began cultivating the esteem component, and then there was a more political focus. Then it became more specific around manhood development and training and what that meant. And I began looking at myself very differently when I looked out in the world. And I'm gonna stop there and there may be another question to ask because it'll lead into some of the other things that you share. But that's how I began my process around rites of passage. And then I'll move into how I got to Baltimore at some point. But it was those formative years when, you know, a teenager starts moving, I began moving into more an independent space. And it was so on point and so timely in that moment.
So can you talk more about like what rites of passage is, and then talk about for you, how is it that African-centered rites of passage is a response to colonialism?
So the first thing, what rites of passage is designed to do, there is a philosophical aspect that begins to answer why. And then there is a functional aspect that looks at the practicality of people who are looking to organize themselves. Now, interestingly enough, there's something dynamic about the human body that authentically tends to express itself. So culturally, you put people together, specifically Black people, we're going to begin to organize ourselves around some kind of meaning. So rites of passage is a pro-social system and model that give a group of people an opportunity to ground themselves in a predominant way of thinking, some conditioned tendencies that they've seen as social patterns. And what typically happens is because so there is who am I, Am I who I say I am? And am I all that I ought to be? So those questions gives me an opportunity to look at my life force, my life course, and the life force is the spirituality, the life course, which is that social, psycho, genetic sense of who I am that gives and provides meaning. So it's life force, life course, life cycle, lifespan, and life practice. So that's the model. And it's not in reaction to colonialism. It's a group of people that are affirming who they are. And then we bump up against, or that group of people bump up against those obstacles. And the biggest piece about, and again, I'm not speaking as an authority. This is just the practical way that, and I'll share some examples a little forward. The key component about rites of passage is less about the process and it's about the ongoing development of the self. It's the preservation of a heritage and cultural transmission and legacy. Now, the difference is that every generation, there's a shift in a circumstance, another, maybe a cultural opposition or something, and that culture and that group has to evaluate and assess where they are and what it is that they're dealing with, and either make some innovations for their posterity and the future of the folks that are moving forward. And then that begins to look at that. They have to reevaluate life cycle. Where am I in my development? The life course, like what's the terrain and the setting of my life and what I'm dealing with. In this particular moment, we operate with white Europeans who express themselves in the world around terror, domination, oppression, and a pathology and exploitation. So that becomes that kind of counter. And when we look at the asili that's baked into, or the seed that's baked into who we are, that gives us our existence and our audacity of I amness and the boldness of full self-expression, that's when we begin to start seeing dominant patterns of global Africanity around the diaspora, because it's not just here in America. We'll see patterns of these concepts of Africanity or African self-conscious on the continent and in the diaspora. Mm-hmm. And it provides a sense of power that allows a person to wield this sense of identity for expression and definition based on, it was something that you said earlier around the politics. The social cultural dynamics or symbolism is the politics. Like my culture grounds and defines my politics. So what's important to me, why I'm here, and what I'm dealing with begins to define why housing and shelter is important, why transportation is important, why food systems or how we gather to nourish and nurture ourselves is important. Healthcare, or how do I heal and take care of myself, the environment, the people, the social interactions. It's like that social cultural value symbolism is that thing that frames my politics, and that's power.
Mm-hmm. So let me ask you a follow-up. Because I imagine there's some people who have never experienced anything like African-centered rights. And I know in the context you and I have talked about, we've talked about it in the context of, rites of passage for men, right? Massive rites of passage for boys and transitioning into adulthood. So for people who have no context for the actual process, like having, a line and the different kinds of activities that are associated with bringing folks together, young people together in particular, can you just talk a little bit about that? Again, for people who have no context for what it is, can you talk a little bit about the process, examples of the kinds of activities that are involved in a rites of passage process?
Right. So fundamentally, it's a process that introduces, well, before I talk about introduces males to the roles and responsibilities of manhood, again, it's an infrastructure that reinforces itself. So what it actually needs is healthy, emotional men and women who are practicing and engaging in their life practice. So that would look like men's societies, women's societies, and they're cultivating their level of development and and inside of an African axiology, relationship is the value set that is key and paramount. So these men societies and women's societies are operating in a village mentality that sets up a social governance structure that begins to educate and train cyclically. It's a circular, not a linear training. Mm-hmm. And what that looks like is a process that produces a product. And in rites of passage, you have rites of separation, rites of transition, and then you have rites of incorporation. And that particular training is designed to enhance a person's spiritual health, emotional health, mental health, and physical health, and begin to activate their internal network. So it brings things online for pubescent, adolescent, and emerging adults that the men and women's societies have been practicing for some time, and it's their job to begin to activate that, to turn on the African self-consciousness. And then they begin to look at life path. They begin to look at vocation. They begin to look at their destiny, why they're here, what's important to them. And then even in simpler terms, from a practical standpoint, how do I operate in my home, right? What kind of a housemate am I? What is the social demand that's being asked? This is one of the things that Bob Mohler mentioned to me a long time ago. He said, rites of passage is going to dictate the social needs that the people are dealing with at that time. So I like to call and say urban rights, because we, particularly here in North America, are operating in this urban environment. So what's the social landscape that we're operating inside of that looks to have young boys process in a way where they're getting information to perform at their best self, to maintain a healthy social environment that promotes their development and prepares them to step into more responsible positions as they become adults. So some of the other things would be drumming. Drumming is so important. It was actually one of the things that was taken from us during the slave system and the Stonewall Rebellion, because there's lots of intricate social programming and what's that word? There is a social algorithm connected in the rudiments of drumming that are very complex, that communicates a sense of affirming internally and externally. Then we have movement, martial movement. We are more sedentary in this day and age. So it's important that young boys discover a sense of who they are and begin to learn and grow inside of themselves and understand what this machinery means and how they navigate it, right? We always say rites of passage is like the steering wheel to move and navigate the machinery. In the cultural context is the information that's uploaded on the motherboard that helps these young boys install new software that's going to prepare them and make them ready, give them new abilities, and provide skill cultivation to, again, be in their homes, be in their communities, be in their schools, and to be able to be innovative enough to see what's needed for the future to create and innovate some new things as they stand on that culture. And again, I'm just rambling. I hope what I'm saying.
No, that's helpful. That's helpful. One thing I'm going to ask you, again, this is a follow-up, but I think it goes along with what you just laid out. One of the things I know that I benefited from, and I imagine many of folks who participated in any kind of rights process will benefit from, some of the pieces around like ancestral work. Like, to me, that's like one of the activities, like in terms of, folks that go through a rights process, like the kind of ancestral work and some of the things that's involved. I think there are ways that traditional African culture and more like traditional mainstream contexts are made out to be like mixed mystical or esoteric, but there's like a lot of like real practicality that and things that in terms of human development are extremely important. So could you talk just a little bit about like the kind of ancestral work that is involved when folks go through a rites of passage process? If you could just talk more about that, again, for people that have no context for that.
Yeah, that's part of the life cycle and lifespan and life course, because there is the circle of life where life emanates from, and then there is the process of development, and then there is the sunsetting. And in African culture, we stand and stack our cultural lineage and heritage. It's almost like thinking about, and I say it this way, a research paper. When folks are writing a research paper, they're gathering documents and data and they're stacking information. So who we are as a people is the sum total of hours and hours and seasons of sun rising and sunsets, of people looking up in the stars and observing how the sun is moving, people taking the time to look at social interactions and patterns. And when that transitions and they move on, we have something that we use to stand on to now assess and evaluate who we are based on that past. So ancestral veneration is really important because it gives us a sense of cultural identity that when we look at our cosmology, it measures and gives us a sense of our aesthetic, right? Our beauty. It gives me an opportunity to define how I'm thinking about myself. And it's a family tree. There's an old saying that if you do not know where you've come from, it's very challenging to define where you're actually going to be going. So that ancestral veneration, again, is giving folks an opportunity to, one, get that story, get that narrative of who my grandfather was, who my father was, who my father's father was, who my father's father's father was. And that singular story becomes the context in which I began to weave and put my world and my existence together. And I began to see patterns and themes that give me a sense of what my destiny and vision is. And then I see those things that become complementary. And it also provides a level of strength because, hey, if it was done before, it can be done again. And in the African context, we know that when we speak and we continue to vibrationally express the achievements of our past, we're actually pulling it forward. So it's almost like being a quantum physicist, where you're able to time travel and pull the past into the present. And while I'm in the present, I can actually project into the future with new innovations, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. And that's what that ancestral veneration does. And interestingly enough, the innovations that happen in the future are me assessing some of the achievements of the past and saying, I can innovate on this past way of thinking very newly. It's very different than starting from scratch. I don't have anything. So we utilize our African heritage and lineage to chain link and make tighter connections that give me a stronger sense of who I am and what I'm going to look to move forward.
Yeah, I mean, and that bleeds into the next question, because, we talked about symbols, and there are ways in which sometimes symbols can be trivial, right? Sometimes symbols can kind of be more, ceremony without substance, right? I think that's in particularly in political context, there's a way that symbols have a stigma of being just, kind of formalities or ceremonial. But if you can talk about, and you've done some of that already, like the power of the symbols and the rituals and the ceremony, particularly in the context of, in talking about the power of those things, it's transformational power on those that participate, in rites of passage, like how those symbols, how some of the things that you've already talked through, like how that power manifests itself, particularly in the people, right, who go through the process.
Yeah, there is a model that I talk about a lot: inform, perform, and transform. So the symbols have vibrational coding connected to it. It's language. For instance, one of the key components in this particular iteration of Rites of Passage is the Nguzo Nani. Most people are familiar with the Nguzo Saba, 7 principles. Nani is 8 principles. The 8th principle is Heshima, respect and honor. So utilizing the 8 principles, those principles, one, are Kiswahili, and then they have vibrational coding that's almost like a software. So when we're utilizing umoja, we're saying unity. Well, how do we come together? Why are we coming together? What do we need to do when we actually do come together? What is the behavior that is required when we come together? What's the vision, right? So it becomes an inquiry. And what the rituals do when we're gathering in these particular spaces, it creates this very myopic focus that gets planted into my subconsciousness. So while I'm working on a particular model that was inserted into the rites process, it's literally like a seed that gets dropped. Now, one of the things that people think about when they're thinking ritual, they're thinking of mysticism and, you know, this level of symbolism that you were speaking of. Ritual is this high intense repetition and focus that is compressing that concept in the subconscious, and we're moving through and we're practicing, and that's the perform. So it's in form and then there's perform, and we're working and generating and ruminating on these particular concepts, and at some point there's an explosion. You know, some people say there's a pop, something pops, right? And whatever that pop is going to inform my body in a particular way that's going to impact my behavior, my thoughts, my planning, my action, my belief. And I'm going to be taking action in that way based on situations, circumstances that I'm now interacting and engaging with. And that actually is the transformation. So the trans is the movement, but there is a shift in my space, and then I am in constant work in that new reality that I have experienced, and it's almost like a death of sorts, an ontological death. So the old Andre, 2 seconds ago, before I pop, the new Andre emerges, and I am taking action with that insight. It's called actionable insights. Those actionable insights create the breakthrough. Most people we want to get straight to transformation, but no, I'm taking action with this new insight that was informed in these designed, scheduled exercises. I'll say that, these exercises, and those exercises sometimes are done once, and then they're done sometimes over and over. And it's very much like, an athlete or Olympic athlete or a high level professional athlete drilling something. And then they get, in some moment, they just go into the zone. And when they're in the zone, it's not like they're unaware. They're now they're automated based on the information that they received while they were drilling.
That's really helpful. And even that explanation. I don't know if I've ever told you this before. I remember when I participated in, my first rites process with you a few years ago. One of the things that it inspired in me, and that's why I mentioned the ancestral renovation piece, and inspired in me to look at my own lineage, right, and take that seriously. So I did ancestry.com and was looking up, and one of the things that it led to for me was I actually took a trip. So the furthest back I can go with my own lineage, 1896. Ross Love Sr. was born then in Caswell County, North Carolina. So I actually went in November of 2017. I actually went to Caswell County to talk to family, right? And to learn family stories. And I know for me, one of the things that has done for me, to your point, and what we learned in those processes about, an altar and how to put an altar together, the white cloth and, the pictures, the candle, the offerings, right? Just learning those things, those rituals, I know for me helped to make more present, the presence, kind of the spiritual presence of my own lineage. And it's something that I reflect on and think about. And I notice patterns in my own behavior and my parents' behavior, my siblings. So there are ways that it has made it more present for me. So I share that just as in some ways, an example of what you just laid out, that information and those rituals and how it impacts your consciousness, that subconscious thing. It's something that subconsciously I think about a lot. Right. But I just wanted to share that as an example of kind of what you just laid out.
And I appreciate you sharing that, because what it also does is it concretizes the invisible and brings it into a material reality. And there's like, I always say, like I like to play with words. There's like the rite of passage, like my birthright, right? Then there is the rite, the RITE, ritualized rite of passage. And then there's the rite, WRITE, rite of passage. So the more I start to understand my cultural lineage and get the stories, my narrative becomes more expansive and sophisticated because it's built on actual material data, what do they call it? Primary sources, you know what I mean? Like
That's right.
Primary sources that are coming together and interacting and getting this information. I am now writing and coding in a very different way my reality. And that's the powerful piece of culture, right? We are coding and encoding some aspect of our past and making meaning of it, right? So we're taking this information and then we're creating an analysis, and it's giving me a new way of thinking about who I am in this moment, and then what's the next thing to do in that next second.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So I'm going to shift a little bit. We're going to come back to some of the specific technologies of rights, but I want to shift a little bit and just ask you to talk about, just from your vantage point, some of the history of rites of passage work in Baltimore in particular. You mentioned some national stuff. So if there are national things you want to share in terms of the history of that, I'd love to hear that. But also in particular Baltimore, because I'll share, and I've shared this with you, my kind of teenage, young adult years in Baltimore, there was a lot of white-led nonprofits, and I didn't know much about rites of passage. And it took me a few years to meet folks like yourself, people like, David Miller, and coming across folks like Mohler and Gerald Baker and a variety of folks to even know that it existed. And I remember thinking to myself, like, man, I really wish that I had known more about what it was back then. So I think that history is important. Like, I think, Baltimore has a history in terms of rites of passage. So if you could talk just a little bit about like the history of rites of passage work in Baltimore.
Yeah. So the first thing I'm going to do is share with folks, I am not from Baltimore. When I came to Baltimore, I came in the late 90s. I was familiar with the Harambe Collective because of the African National Rites of Passage United Collective. So I'm going to speak, Brother Devon, as humbly as I can, with a level of reverence. And I'll start with acknowledging some of the ancestors who were instrumental in providing the space for rights to be where it is today. That's Mama Edith Jones, Mama Bibi Fatima, Mama Lola Jenkins, Mama Kay Stansel, Baba Darrell Kofi Kennan, Baba Zara Cody. These are people who are now ancestors, Baba Kamal Kenyatta. And then there are a host of other brothers and sisters who were very fundamental in those late 80 years into the 90s and 2000s. That's like Baba Restaurant Taru, Baba Sakoni Woodland, Mama Rashida Foreman Bay, Mama Natasha Hummingbird Hassan, Mama Alishaba, Mama Lena Harris, Mama Erica, Mama Nasira, Baba Zebulon, Baba Adamola, Baba Jabbar, Baba Olamina, Baba Taharka, Brother David Miller, and Brother Kumasi Johnson. Those were some folks, and I'm sure that there are many, 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 many others. I was like, I want to make sure I share about enough people, because it is that social relationship of folks who are saying this shall be that makes the difference. In the mid 80s, there was something that was happening nationally, this fatherhood movement and mentoring, right, that was occurring. And a lot of folks were retooling and repackaging themselves from the late 60s and early 70s, that tumultuous time. And around the 80s, there was almost like some level of momentum nationally as folks who were thinking about themselves from a Black power perspective were reformulating themselves. Here in Baltimore, Brother Richard Rowe and Brother Earl Alameen were facilitating a midterm program out of the Urban League, and they coined something called matrix mentoring, because like Big Brothers Big Sisters had this one-to-one, and they were like, hey, there is not enough men to do one-to-one mentoring. So matrix mentoring was a term that was coined. Brother Baba Darrell Kofi Kennett and Baba Olamina were two brothers who formulated themselves around that mentoring process with Brother Richard Rowe. And that was like around maybe the 86, 85. And then Baba Kofi Kennett, and this is, me working as best I can, Baba Kofi Kennett and Baba Olamina saw the expansion and the need. And there was a lady named Jessica Stroud who shared some space, and they began operating out of a place called the Family Place. And they began moving mentoring and Big Brothers Big Sisters to a more African-centered space, still taking baby steps. Then they moved from Family's Place to Christ United. And then at that time, Adam Mohler came on board. Like, me getting the history, I was surprised because I always thought Adam Mohler was on board from the very beginning. Now, he was in his own world and realm doing his own level of personal development and the work that he was doing. But the Harambe Collective, that was once the Baltimore Rites of Passage, got started with Darrell Kofi Kennett and Baba Olamina. And as it grew, many of the other brothers came on board, Baba Zeracody, Baba Kenyatta, and many others. And then they went to Douglas High School because, again, it got bigger. And then they became the Baltimore Rites Collective. And again, it expanded even more. So as it expanded, then you had Mama Rashida Foreman Bay, Mama Natasha Hummingbird, and many of them other sisters that came on. They began working with the men. And what I was told, that there was upwards of about 200 or so participants in their heyday. And what they said was they were so successful that probation officers, those probation officer programs were sending the folks who were re-entering to their program, and they were like, hey, but they weren't sending any money with us. So that's when they said, hey, we need to formulate a 501c3 and be a little more strategic about this. And that's when the Harambe Collective came in, and that was about around 1995 or so. And that's significant because I was still in Norfolk, Virginia at that point. I'm still working with Askia Mental Hotel with Manhood Through Uplift. And either 94 or 95, we hosted a conference. Askia became the national chair for the African National Rites of Passage United Collective. And I mean, all of the various collectives, Baltimore, Delaware, Cleveland, Columbus, Philadelphia, St. Louis, Chicago. I mean, people was coming from all over. They convened And the conference was every other year. This year convened in Norfolk. Bam! Who's in Norfolk? I'm in Norfolk. This was game changing for me because in New York, I was a part of, and this is not dismissive, I was part of like an after school program. Right? It was like an after school program. When I got to Norfolk, I began seeing something more structured and more organized that began focusing on some more components and tools around rites of passage. When folks came to Norfolk, specifically Baltimore, I was like, whoa. Like my thinking began changing. And here goes a quick story that I'll never forget. All of the collectives or shoelays, they call them, coming in, right? You got this registration, everybody's gathering, they're getting their room assignments because they're staying in the dorms. The Philly Shoelay Collective bus broke down. And they had to go take care of the bus. The elders, the adult males, the adult men. So they're in the registration line planning and organizing how they're going to move forward. And they're and I hear them because I'm at the registration table. They're telling some teenagers, we're going to leave y'all in charge and we're going to have to go figure this thing out with the bus. And I'm like, whoa, you can't do that. You can't do that. They're doing their planning. The adults leave. They leave teenagers in charge. They couldn't have been no more than 15, 16. And it was a bunch of them. Now, mind you, they're still in the village. So adults would have addressed them accordingly. Them teenagers and youth handle themselves. And I'm talking about like in an impeccable way. And I had to ask myself, okay, what was I thinking about? But I was thinking about what I was thinking about. Like, yeah, you can't leave Black people together. These kids are going to be wild and acting crazy. These teenagers, they completely annihilated that. And I was like, whoa. And then I met Baba Dara Kofi Kennan. I met Baba Ademola. I met Brother Kofi. Sean Holmes was like one of the youth leaders of the national space. So I just started seeing like a richer organization of roles and responsibilities and higher orders. And Baltimore was definitely in full effect. They were definitely in full effect. And beyond that conference, you had the Million Man March, which concretized or amplified, this particular moment in history even further. They had a heyday. And one of the things that the men of the Harambe Collective, which was formerly Baltimore Rites of Passage Collective, those men began to realize that they had never gone through a rites of passage, and they were taking boys down to Oyo Tunji village on a regular. They decided for themselves, this is like the late 90s, that we need to take ourselves through a process. And they then gave themselves designed a 1-year adult male rite of passage process. And out of that, the Egbe of Kokoreen was founded. And in that same moment, there were some brothers on the west side of Baltimore who had seen the benefits of the Harambe Collective, and they stepped up. And that's when Brother Kumasi and some of his friends formed Akabilon Youth Rites of Passage. And they began doing work. They were also at the conference. And Akabilon picked up into the late 90s, into the early to mid 2000s. And that's when I got to Baltimore. When I got to Baltimore, I met up with Kumasi, and I started working with him on Akabilon Youth Rites of Passage. And it's amazing to see, because we now meet some boys who we had worked with who are adults now. And Rites of Passage, man, it works, man. And I went through an adult. Me, Kamasi, David Miller were the third line that had come through the Egbe Kokoreen Rites of Passage. So it was very fresh in that moment. And I'll never forget it. Like who I am as a father, a husband, are directly connected to the sum total of those experiences, including, my father as well. So my family background, I stand firmly and strong on as well. And it's funny, I'm fighting my my colonial thinking, because I immediately went to nuclear family. Nuclear family is very different than village. I felt like I had to say my father, which I did, but in village thinking, it's a given. Nuclear family, village, very, very, very different. So that was just an interesting moment for me.
Can you, and that actually wraps into really the last question. One of the contexts that we operate in, some of our work at LBS is, supporting public investments in community-based violence prevention. I'm sure, as you think about like mass incarceration, like law enforcement, criminal justice system was weaponized against our community. And many, Black men uniquely as it relates to mass incarceration, law enforcement. And we spend a lot of time fighting that kind of political impulse of folks to use the criminal justice system as the primary way to deal with many of the challenges that we face in our community. And so for us, like Rites of Passage is one of those interventions, right? Not that Rites of Passage in and of itself is a violence prevention instrument, but that it as a process can help towards addressing the kinds of violence that we see in our community. So if you could like make that connection, and then the reason why, what you just said about nuclear versus village is because I think when you think about a lot of the conservative right-wing attacks against Black people, it's the imposition of this notion of the nuclear family, right, as almost like their blueprint or architecture for what Black people should be doing, and their rationale as to describing us as pathological or backward or uncivilized or whatever the case may be. So if you could talk about like Rites of Passage in the context of addressing many of the challenges that produce violence in our community, like what are some of the unique aspects of Rites of Passage that addresses itself to violence in our community?
Man, that's deep. So the first thing, and you mentioned it, but I want to kind of blow it up because you said it, but it's important because like in the, as you call it, the nonprofit industrial complex, folks word and write grants all day with the problem statement. It's very deficit based and it's focused and centered on the challenges or the abnormal situations. And Rites of Passage in its essence is not even a counter. It's an is. It's self-determining ways of being that give me a life practice for pro-social, healthy, communal, relational pedagogy and interaction. So it's self-worth and identity, and it sets self-fortifying boundaries out the gate. Like, forget anything else. Like, the human is designed to perpetuate itself in the most optimal way, starting at a survival level to thrivation, right? Like, once I begin to get my resources together, I create some patterns and I see some things, I move from, I cultivate the resources and then I become more adept and skilled, and now we begin thriving. So Rites of Passage is about developing preparation for readiness, like asking the question again, who am I? Who am I? What's the inquiry? Rites of Passage begins to develop individuals' abilities. Why am I here? What is my purpose? Rites of Passage begins to cultivate skill sets and takes talent, and how do we cultivate that talent, and human capital. And then there is the mindset, heart set, the soul set, and the health set. And we take these particular domains and we begin powering up and chambering this inside the individual. So now I get a stronger perception of myself as I'm moving and processing through, cycling through these tenets and these concepts. I'm getting a healthy self-actualization through the rituals, through the routines, through the structures, through the pathways, interacting with healthy adults, my peers. I'm doing peer bonding, right? Intergenerational conversations and interactions. And I'm exercising and practicing customs and reinforcing values that give way to healthy environments that create a sense of safety for people to begin to build and further themselves. And what that does is, when we have challenges around, so I'll share this. Vivek Murthy, our current Surgeon General, 2 years ago had isolation and loneliness as a challenge for Americans, and that was post-COVID. Then it was social media, and now it's gun violence. So when we are dealing or addressing these particular challenges, when I'm not grounded in myself, when I'm not connected to someone, be it a peer or a healthy adult, I'm very vulnerable. And there isn't an opportunity to validate myself with someone with a mirror image that reinforces those particular values. So in that level of vulnerability, sometimes there's a tendency to drift. And then that drift, if I don't have a destination, many of the negative, disparate, and disparaging devices that come with white European terror, domination, pathology, oppression, and exploitation grind and eat folks up. And literally that's poor health, poor eating habits, right? The music that gets listened to, we begin to ingest more of a particular way of a way of visualizing who we are or how we think about ourselves based on someone else's access to these media platforms. And what Rites of Passage does, not in reaction to, again, humans are always formulating and organizing themselves in an optimal way. And as we become more adept and stand on shoulders, that organization becomes more sophisticated, structured, and efficient in terms of expressing how do I go out in the world and say, I am, as a way of being. And this is how I be in the world. So the violence is an aberration of structures and systems. And the beautiful part that I think is this new space that Rites of Passage is moving into, and I think this is where you and Adam and Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle are very important, is helping the process focus the lens on an analysis. Because when I'm going out and I'm saying, who am I? Am I who I say I am? And am I all that I ought to be? It's important to have an analysis based on that location, like that life course. And life course is the terrain. I have to be able to assess and evaluate and develop an analysis of those social structures that may not be for my best interest. And Rites of Passage does very well. And again, self-worth and self-fortifying boundaries. Now, the next component is, how do I develop an analysis for these degenerative systems that suck life out of our communities, especially when you have low resources, underdeveloped resources, uninvested resources, poor and low economics. Like, these situations pull for something that, and it's just been the perfect instance. John Hopkins did a study called The Well-Being of Adolescents in Vulnerable Environments. It's called the WAVE study. I think it was a waste of money. It pretty much said people who live in impoverished communities, impoverished conditions, have challenges. It's like, yeah. And they went around the world and looked at 6 different countries and looked at impoverished communities, underinvested communities. And I was like, man, when you live in poor conditions, this is what you're going to get. And what Rites of Passage does, as, I don't even want to say a response. It's like, it's that right. It's that first right, the RIGHT, my right to exist and be self-determined in who I am as an individual. And not because I say so, but because I see healthy adults moving and expressing themselves in ways in men's societies, women's societies, complementing each other, continually developing themselves. And what they're doing in that village space is creating this web and this network that wraps their arms in this insulating way around the vulnerable children and welcomes them and ushers them into a space where they get to come back. And that's the counter piece. I think the word that feels good for me is counter, because counter is like reaction. It's almost like I don't feel a lot of power there. And that may not be like, you're good with words, but like reaction and response, yeah, but the counter is like, nah, I'm good. I'm well-trained. I have some tools. I mean, I have all my tools, but I can think and move my way through a situation because my culture, my training, my value set, my epistemology, my way of meaning making allows me to look at my life, the course, the terrain, and begin to develop my weapons in a way to counter whatever that opposing force is coming at me. And Rites of Passage is a piece of a larger model and system and culture that gives a group of people a sense of themselves, mission, meaning, and even a vision forward that doesn't have a full definition, because that's what the next generation coming in who gets trained begin to write. Like, that's that third right. They begin to write that. They begin to edit and upgrade on that in that intergenerational conversation.
Yeah, I mean,
I don't know if I'm just talking, man.
look, but you know, that's actually really helpful. I mean, there's a way that you're describing a science to the use of culture and these tools in ways that I just don't think there's a lot of conversations publicly about. You know, as I said, the audience that is likely to hear this podcast, they've been exposed to examples of culture that I think have been reduced to very trivial, more celebratory, as opposed to really understanding the science behind the use of culture, and just the level of intentionality, the level of rigor. So, I mean, I want to thank you for having this conversation and really providing some of that rigorous background for African-centered Rites of Passage. One of the things for those that are listening to this podcast, one of the projects that we work on together is the Baltimore Rites of Passage initiative,
Yes.
right? And so for me, it was just important to have this conversation as a way for people who are wondering, like, what is rights? What are some of the things, theories, perspectives, history behind it, to really give it a much fuller picture. And I imagine, folks who listen to this will, decide there's some research they want to do, like some of those names you mentioned, right? Like there's some folks that I think will be good for people that want to do further research. So again, I want to thank you for coming on. This hour kind of went by pretty fast. But like I said, I think we covered a lot of ground. Any like final things you want to say before we wrap up?
You're really good with words, Devon. And for me, it is, I would say, like, rites of passage is an operating system. And I think in this day and age where, AI is big, and the biggest AI is ancestral intelligence, by the way, folks, or African intelligence, because that's the nipple and root of all. But in this tech world, I think there is a nice way for our youth and even our adults who, are kind of connected to these devices, can kind of see how this science and this technology can be useful and beneficial to them, because we're always uploading apps, we're always uploading software, we're always downloading something. There's conversation about putting in chips for expanding space. So if we can see ourselves as this highly advanced machinery, like, what are we uploading, right? What kind of culture that is innate to us are we uploading to give us a sociological outcome that has me realize what's important to me, why am I here, and what am I currently dealing with? And rites of passage is one of those things that, again, is an operating system that helps, that supports that individual's personal development, and expands the whole group and collective.
That's a good way to end. So again, I appreciate you, Baba Turner, for coming on In Search of Black Power. Appreciate the conversation. Again, for those listeners, again, I'm Devon Love, Director of Public Policy, Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle, In Search of Black Power. Until next time.